Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Daily Report. I'm your host, Vago Muradia. Our podcast is brought to you by Bell. Since 1935, Bell has been redefining flight. Learn more about its pioneering spirit at bellflight.com. And joining us now are Dr. Sal Mercogliano, who is an associate professor of history at Campbell University in North Carolina. He teaches world maritime history as well as maritime security. He's also an adjunct professor at the U.S. Merchant Marine Academy. And also joining us is our very own Christopher P. Cavus, who is our contributing editor. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Vago.
Thank you, Vago.
And before we get started, a shout out to all of our sponsors. Our global coverage is sponsored by Leonardo DRS. Northrop Grumman sponsors our weekly cyber report and broader cyber coverage. Fincantieri Marinette Marine sponsors our naval coverage. And of course, our podcast is sponsored by Bell. Sal, let's start off with you. You know, there are almost, as I said in the introduction, almost all the coverage about the pandemic and its transportation impacts have focused on the air transport industry, sort of this empire in the sky of, you know, whether it's, you know, the number of people who basically spend their days on airplanes, as well as on the cruise ship industry, but not actually the broader the impact of this global crisis on the broader maritime industry, on which the extraordinary bulk of global trade travels. Talk to us about the impact on the ships, the impact on the ports, given sort of quarantine periods and what we're talking about, and then also the impact on the military sea lift command, without which supporting the fleet at sea becomes something almost impossible to do. And I should point out, Chris wants to comment on that. And I should also point out that you've got a book that is available through the Naval History and Heritage Command, Fourth Arm of Defense, Sea Lift, and Maritime Logistics in the Vietnam War. Sal, take it away.
Sure. Thank you, Vago. Well, back in February, when we first saw the instances of this hitting, we witnessed a slowdown coming out of Wuhan, China, obviously. And one of the things that needs to be understood is the absolute interconnectivity of the global supply chain network. We have developed a system where basically it's just in, just out logistics. Basically, we feed our logistics system commercially and unfortunately militarily the same exact way. We basically have goods continually on a movement scale, and any disruption caused by a hurricane, a natural disaster of any kinds, we witness those small disruptions. What you're seeing right now is a global disruption, and something we have really not seen since the world wars on this level, but global trade is at a much higher level than ever before. And so what we witnessed early on in this incident was a slowdown in exports coming out of China and a slowdown of imports going into China. And that's because of the shutdown in manufacturing. And what many predicted and saw happening was this is going to have impacts down the supply chain. So it doesn't impact the United States in February, but it's going to impact them 4 to 6 weeks later when those goods are supposed to be offloaded in U.S. ports, goods that would be go into car manufacturing and the defense industry. And what we witnessed is a slowdown in that. We saw the port of Shanghai and major ports, and understand out of the 20 largest container ports in the world, 9 of them are in China. And so when China announces a slowdown, it has a massive impact on the global supply chain network. And what we're seeing across the board here in the commercial industry is different facets of it are experiencing change. So as you mentioned before, the cruise industry is one of the most visible to the common public. And what we saw right off the bat was how the cruise ships started seeing those infections. And that's largely because cruise ships are really a bringing together of the world. You have largely a third world crew on board with first world passengers. And many of those cruise lines get their crews from largely the Far East. And most shipping actually gets most of their crews from the Far East. So if you want to see what's hitting shipping right now, there's a litany of events going on. So one of the big things is crew lockdown. India estimates that about 400,000 of its mariners are trapped somewhere in the world in the middle of transit. And what that means is it's hard to get crews off vessels, replace those crews, and fly them out. And crews operate on ships for different periods of time depending on their contracts. But if you can't get crews on and off vessels, if you can't give them priority in air travel, then they become trapped, and it becomes harder later on to get crew replacements. Crews will not want to work under those conditions. And if you don't have crews for vessels, obviously you see a breakdown happen in that. We're seeing port congestion. We're seeing issues with port congestion. Just recently in Australia, the Australian dock workers in Sydney announced they will not touch a ship unless it's been in quarantine for at least 14 days. In other words, it has not touched any other port for 14 days. And what you're getting then is not the smooth flow of cargo into a port, but a pulse of cargo coming in. And now all of a sudden you're creating a disruption in the trade. You're having the cancellation of contracts. It's estimated there are going to be what's called 250 blank sailings to Europe from the Far East next quarter. That means 250 ships are not going to sail. That means not only is the goods not going to move, but all the port handling, port charges, it has ramifications down the chain. I'll give you an example. Recently, Mediterranean Shipping Company brought in one of their large ships into Long Beach, one of their 20,000 box ships. Typically, they use about 15,000 or between 12 and 15,000. But the reason they had to bring in that large ship isn't because they're moving goods, is they had to bring back empty containers because the containers were not moving. Right. So they literally had to load the ship with 5,000 empty containers because there was a shortage of containers in China. Insurance. The insurance industry, mariners and shipping companies will take insurance on delayed cargo, additional costs incurred, and more importantly, for cargo that is vulnerable, that may go bad. And if you disrupt the supply chain, if you can't move goods very well, then all of a sudden insurance companies begin to pay out more and more money. We saw that in 2008 with the mortgage companies. And if insurance companies get themselves strapped in a position where they're paying out more than they're paying in, we could see a collapse in the insurance company. And then perhaps, of course, the thing that always you have to remember in the maritime industry is the unique nature of the maritime industry is it's cross-pollinated, it's multinational. And so legal disputes, when there are issues at play, so if a company decides to issue a force majeure, which is basically a cancellation of a contract due to a force of nature or superior force, that's what it translates to be. Usually you have to go into a legal dispute, but those disputes can involve multinational aspects. You may have a company with a ship that's registered in Panama, but the corporation is in Switzerland, and then the cargo is spread across multiple entities. And so it becomes a very interesting play here for how this is all impacting the maritime industry. On the commercial side, on the military side, you mentioned Military Sealift Command. Military Sealift Command is fed by the commercial industry. And when ports are unavailable, if you can't bring in your supply ship into your port, then those supply ships, whether it's a tanker or a cargo ship, has what's in its holds. And once it empties it out, it's unable to refill itself.
Chris, your take on that, given that you've been talking to your sources both on the military side but also on the commercial side regarding impacts.
Yeah, so some ports, we were talking earlier, some ports are up, some ports are down. Port of Los Angeles is probably the worst hit port everywhere because they're the primary intake for shipping from China, for imports from China. So just for March, they're down 31% over the same quarter of last year. Their container volume has dropped to the lowest point since February 2009. They were already suffering from the trade war with China, and then this hit, which has really knocked them down further. They, however, remain open. They're really co-located with the Port of Long Beach, kind of merged together. They remain open. Most ports are open. The Port of New York and New Jersey, New York, the epicenter right now in the United States, is still open. The core of the port are open and operating under normal conditions. That's the Port of New York and New Jersey. Port of Baltimore remains open, although one of the main commercial terminals has cut back on hours. It's actually not operating for 1 or 2 days a week, and its operating hours are shorter than they normally were. Port of Virginia seems to be operating normally. I just had an interesting discussion with the president of the Puget Sound Pilots Association, about the port of Seattle and various ports around the Puget Sound area, and I'll go more into his concerns later. But he actually surprisingly told me that the port of Seattle, despite being the first major city in the location in the United States to be hit by the virus, is doing pretty well. They've 538 transits in the month of March, which is about normal. So they are not down. Traffic is moving. There are other issues. I'll talk about that a little bit. But so you do see traffic still working. But to Sal's points about quarantines and delays and of course, people are not being allowed off the ships. The ships themselves are pretty guarded about who comes on board. There's a lot of issues with that, and ships have to have people come on. That's actually probably the Theodore Roosevelt, probably somebody in the course of doing business, people go on and off aircraft carriers all the time. That's probably more likely how it got onto the ship. But ships are not bastions unto themselves. They do have to interact.
It's one question which I had for Sal, and to point out, right? I mean, there are 200,000 people who are on 300 cruise ships, right? I mean, just to show you the magnitude of the industry and its footprint. Although, Chris, I have to say, I think that Navy officials think that it got on from the port visit in Da Nang is where they think it happened. Although it is curious that it took 15 days for that to show up. Sal, when it comes to all of the stimulus packages, Congress is now assessing a fourth stimulus package that's going to be in the $1 trillion range, if not more. How much of this is aimed at these shipping companies? Because the United States has a very, very small merchant marine. We rely on the likes of, as you said, Mediterranean, which is the world's second largest cargo carrier. Maersk is, Maersk. Is Maersk number one?
Maersk is number one.
Yeah. Maersk is number one. Okay. I wasn't sure if one of the Chinese companies had displaced them. Talk to us a little bit about how this aid is, because, for example, cruise ship lines are not owned by U.S. companies in general, right? So they didn't benefit from a lot of this stimulus money, even though these ships are integral to the American economy. Talk to us about the stimulus packages and how they're affecting that dynamic.
Sure. As you aptly noted right there's only 180 deep draft vessels left in the U.S. Merchant Marine. The U.S. Merchant Marine today is 22nd in the world. So it does not have a large footprint. And of those 180 vessels, only about 80 of them are involved in international trade. 60 of them are under a program called the Maritime Security Program, where they receive money from the Department of Defense to basically be established on key shipping lines that help integrate and sustain American forces overseas. But the stimulus package, as you mentioned, was geared to U.S. companies. The three largest cruise line companies, Carnival, Royal Caribbean, and Norwegian, even though they're headquartered down in Dade County in southern Florida, they're within 20 miles of each other. All three of them are incorporated overseas, Panama, the Bahamas, and Liberia. And of their almost 200 ships in their various fleets, only one, the Pride of America, is American flag that operates out in Hawaii. And so there was and
that's because of the Jones Act.
That's right. The Jones Act and the Passenger Service Vessel Act requires them to be U.S. flagged, U.S. built, and U.S. crewed, and to operate within the coastal waters of the United States. And there was a very visceral reaction against giving money to the cruise lines because of that, even though they do provide a huge amount of income to the United States. Southern Florida derives a vast amount of money from those ships, from port charges, from supplying, husbandry, and even to personnel on board. Many of the port engineers, many of the workers are American. But again, it's the fact that they are registered offshore basically precluded them from taking or for being eligible for any of this money. And a lot of discussion right now about potentially bringing some of those ships over to the U.S. flag. It's very difficult to do that. The issue isn't so much the officers and the unlicensed crew members, it's the hotel staff. And they just become uneconomical at that level. Some of the cruise companies, one of the things this is showing is why it's such a good versatility to have a U.S. flagged merchant marine, because again, one of the things that's being done across the world is shipyards are shutting down. One of the innovations, or one of the instances that just happened recently, is the implementation of IMO 2020, which requires either new fuel, low sulfur fuel being used, or the installation of scrubbers to scrub the exhaust. Well, with the shutdown of many shipyards, those scrubbers are not being installed. And many companies had banked on using overseas shipyards for that. And so there may be a little bit of an impetus here to start seeing perhaps a resurgence in the U.S. merchant marine and in U.S. maritime industry around the country. And that's maybe an offshot of this entire event.
Let me just ask a parenthetic question, right? Ships have gotten larger and larger and larger and larger because trying to economies of scale effectively is the idea. Does this crisis, I mean, if you project this forward, how is this crisis going to affect this industry? You know, before we got started, you know, we were joking that this might be the best time to book that around the world trip on the Queen Mary 2 that, you know, you've been dreaming about. On the other hand, there's a question about when this industry recovers. So it's kind of a two-part question. A, when does the industry itself recover? And B, does something like this actually drive an interest in sort of more smaller ships at the end of the day?
The one word, if you walk away from this conversation about the maritime industry, the one word to remember is consolidation. The 3 cruise lines I mentioned control 85% of the cruise industry. The 8 largest container liners, which are organized into 3 large alliances, control 80% of the container industry. And one of the things you're seeing, and to use the cruise industry for an example, Carnival was just able to float a $6 billion loan because they have the assets to basically use against it.
And I said the Saudis also made an investment in the company, right? I mean, I think they bought an 8% stake.
They did. They bought an 8.5% stake. And one of the issues they have is they have the capability to soak up a loss better than a smaller company. And I almost think that this is what you're going to see happen as a result of this, is smaller companies. So, for example, the Singapore operates a container liner called PIL, the Pacific International Line. And they're about the 9th largest company. They're just below that threshold. And it'll be interesting to see if that company gets sucked up into those mega alliances and purchased. And that's what you're seeing right now, is consolidation in the container ship industry, in the cruise ship industry, and you're probably about ready to see it in the tanker industry too, because the tanker industry is a whole other market that's operating in a different area right now, with the Saudis and the Russians flooding the market with cheap gas.
Chris, you know, a lot of the focus, you know, certainly with the Teddy Roosevelt incident has been on the Navy, but the Coast Guard remains the integral service, both for coastal ports, but also inshore traffic. Chris, where's the Coast Guard both on impact of coronavirus on its team, but more broadly, the statistics and information that it's putting out, seeing as how it's essential for each port nationwide, and actually any American port worldwide?
It's a little difficult to gauge what's really going on, because the nature of the Coast Guard is that it's fairly fragmented all around the country in fairly small units, and getting aggregate statistics is a little misleading and difficult sometimes. But you know, some of they certainly have to go on board ships, so
every single ship is visited by Coast Guard guys, right? I mean, whether they go in and out of port.
You have to meet certain standards to enter United States waters. People go on and do inspections all the time. That brings risk everywhere you go, and it's not a question of just wiping down the wheelhouse. It's, you know, the Coast Guard inspectors are poking all through the ship anywhere they want to go. That's these days not a very safe thing to do. It's certainly risky, but so they're either doing it or they're not doing it, or they're not doing it very well. Probably more like the latter. It's not something anybody wants to admit, but it's probably true. I've had some anecdotal discussions. I have one person I know runs an import-export business in the United States to Northern Europe, and he's very concerned that nobody's doing security inspections on a lot of his containers. that stuff that's normally, there are all these checklists they have to go through when things are being shipped, and you're supposed to, open a few up, take a look in. People aren't doing it; they're just doing checks, and I'm not going to do it. And he's been on the scene, asking people about it. They're going, we're just not going to do it. That's anecdotal, but it also makes some sense. So there's probably this is major opportunity. In all of this, there's opportunity for bad behavior, and among that are smugglers, so drug smugglers, human trafficking, terrorists, whatever you want to put under the heading of smugglers. This is a land of opportunity right now, and people just are not doing due diligence where they should. And who knows how long that will go on. So there is that, and that is a manpower issue. They're chronically undermanned anyway, usually in these situations. By the way, even and this is the foreign port agents too, because the Coast Guard has agents in foreign ports,
Right.
United States Coast Guard, to check shipments that are bound for the United States, and they're just not. They're, at least from that level, anecdotal evidence, they're probably not doing everything that they should be doing. It's got to have an effect.
Sal, what's next? And what do policymakers have to bear in mind as we do this? Because we still have instances where there are Americans that are trapped on ships that state and local municipalities won't let dock to debark their passengers.
Well, I think there's several issues that are at play. Obviously, the crews are the biggest one right now. That's the issue that's underlying the entire industry, is to be able to move crews. Unfortunately, mariners are not identified as a priority, and so therefore many of them are stuck overseas. The International Maritime Organization, which is an agency of the United Nations that basically coordinates with nations under port state control and other agreements, are trying to establish certain hubs so that they can move mariners. There was an attempt to identify some key sites around the world where ships can get to basically move their crews around. So if you're looking at the cruise industry, for example, again, as a case in point, they're getting crews off vessels now. They're basically depopulating the vessels. Well, they can't do them through commercial flights anymore. So they're literally charting flights right now to do that. And I think one of the things we see coming out of this is agreements in place to establish at main hubs, Singapore, Gibraltar, Suez, these key routes to basically be able to get the crews out. One of the things we're seeing is consolidation. We're seeing shipping companies consolidating their transportation of goods and moving goods. So, for example, the main shipping route in the world right now is what's called the East-West route. It's the Europe to Asia route. And one of the things we're seeing is shipping companies, because of the excess space available now with the reduction in voyages, are routing ships around the southern tip of Africa. They're bypassing Suez. And so they're taking advantage of timeframes here to be able to move their cargo. But I think one of the biggest things I take away from it, Vago, is the idea of how much our supply system is coordinated and factored into this just in, just out logistics system. Go back to the Persian Gulf War of the 1990s. One of the things that pushed the Persian Gulf War into March for the kickoff of that war was the requirement by General Pagonis to build up a 90 to 100 day supply of goods in Saudi Arabia before the kickoff of the offensive. We don't do that militarily anymore. We don't do that commercially anymore.
Right.
Very, very little do we have supplies stored up. And I think that's going to be a big reconsideration going forward.
Obviously, right. I mean, just-in-time delivery, the advantage of that is you're not carrying inventory. The disadvantage of that is you're not carrying any inventory. So, if that supply chain gets disrupted, you're in deep kimchi, as the saying goes. Chris, some round-out thoughts on your part?
I just spoke just shortly ago with Captain Eric Van Brandenfels, who's the president of the Puget Sound Pilots Association. Now, all around the country, there are pilots associations. For those who don't pay much attention, every ship coming into controlled waters has got to have a pilot on board to do the local navigation. Ships don't just drive into town by themselves. And these pilot associations are very local. This Puget Sound. There's, Chesapeake Bay, Maryland, Virginia, any port you want. So this is them, and they've been on this since February, really the middle of February. They were very concerned with the Wuhan virus. They were very concerned early on with ships coming in from China. Captain Branagh told me that he's, from the get-go, they've been very conservative in their approach. Lots of personal protection equipment, and it seems to be paying off. There are 49 members. They so far have not had a positive test, which is pretty impressive. And in these days when most of the news we hear anywhere is negative, this was, talking to him was actually not a negative story very much. They were dealing with it, but he did talk about how social distancing as a term is a problem. You have in terms of language interpretation. So social distancing meant to some of these crews, foreign crews, no communications, staying away, and they've had to they strenuously try to talk about physical distancing. We still want to talk to you, but don't disconnect from communications. So physical distancing has been a term. They said most of the ships are pretty good about wiping things down before they get there. They're just as worried about you coming on board as you're worried about going on board them. Like I said, he reports the traffic in Puget Sound is pretty much the usual deal. They don't have a lot of cruise ships till May normally, so it's all commercial, but tankers, container ships, general bulk cargo. Most of their guys are working overtime. They had, their average job is about 9 hours when they go through, and they're doing okay. He did say that it's you can tell in terms of the crews of the ships and their levels of anxiety, that the foreign crews, because they sign up for longer terms, usually typically 9 months, they're not so worried about always getting off the ships right now. The American flag ships that they have coming in are very much worried. He said those crews usually sign up for 30-day tours, and they don't know how they're going to get off, and can they go anywhere when they get off? Can they go home?
Right.
Is anybody going to relieve them? All that. So he said there's a palpable difference between the American crews worrying about their own personal situation, how am I going to deal with this, and the foreign crews, which was sort of interesting.
Guys, thanks very much for joining us. A lot to discuss here. Would love to have you guys back because I think that as a general rule, folks have a tendency of forgetting this absolutely critical element of just not just U.S. national security, but also international prosperity. Thanks so much for joining us. We appreciate it and hope you both have a very happy Easter.
Thank you, Vago. Good luck.
Thank you, Vago. Appreciate it.
Sal, I just want to have you follow up on the ships that have infections on them, some of which involve the crew, and what happens to them, because before we started taping, Chris pointed out that the Centers for Disease Control has identified 20 ships with coronavirus on them, and there's a tendency of sort of focusing on, Zandam or whatever, even though that issue has largely, at least the sick people have been taken off that ship. Talk to us a little bit about what the resolution here is for all of these other ships, because that's quite a lot of people we're talking about.
It is. The 7th Coast Guard District came out with a directive not to land any crew any longer in the United States. And so the directive came out from the Coast Guard to basically keep crew on board, and if you have sick crew on board, to manage them on board until they reach a condition where they deserve medical condition ashore, basically that level. And so the cruise lines are scrambling now to try to get those crew members off. The problem is you do have infected crew members on board, and not an efficient way to test all crew members. And this is the hesitation that a lot of people have to land those crews on their shores, because they haven't all been adequately tested or screened.
So what's the solution to that?
The solution, what they're going to do is try to charter flights out of the Bahamas or Barbados and be able to fly them back to their countries of origin. That's what they're doing it with private chartered flights, so they don't have to deal with commercial flights.
But that still constitutes an infection exposure risk for a lot of people who may now be healthy, right? I mean, it would seem to be, wouldn't it be a lot better to figure out some way to test these guys before you get them off the ship, as opposed to jamming them all on an airplane with 300 people and have them get sick there?
They're running them through a quarantine, so they're holding those crews on board
Right.
for the set period of time.
That's it. Okay.
CDC, which I think is 14 days. And then they're clearing them out. Because what's going to happen now is the CDC just came out and said that no cruising is allowed out of the United States for 100 days. So you're about to see all the cruise ships go into a cold layout. They'll start anchoring them and docking them somewhere and taking the entire hotel staff off and probably most of the engine and bridge staff off.
It's unbelievable.
On April 9th, CDC extended the no sail order, and they have 100, according to CDC, on April 9th. There are approximately 100 cruise ships remaining at sea off the U.S. coasts, with nearly 80,000 people on board. Astounding number.
There's a huge
Out of
anchor
sight.
in the Bahamas right now. They're all sitting at.
Mm-hmm.
It's just absolutely extraordinary. Gentlemen, thanks so very, very much again for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Vago.
Thank you, Vago.
And thanks for joining us. Please follow our daily interviews with top government, military, industry, and thought leaders at Defense and Aerospace Report, and subscribe to our weekly newsletter. Follow us on Twitter at DEFAERO Report. That's at DEFAERO Report. Like us on Facebook at Defense and Aerospace Report, and check us out on LinkedIn. And check out our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman, and our technology report sponsored by General Motors Defense. For more than 80 years, Bell has pushed past the boundaries of what's possible to drive aviation forward, going above and beyond flight. Bellflight.com. Thanks again to Bell for their generous sponsorship, and we'll see you again tomorrow.